Hello, YouTube. Today, I wish to speak about a certain topic. We could say within philosophy, within the domain of philosophy, which is concerned with individuals, perhaps in the most general sense of the word, which at least I understand as roughly synonymous with particulars. So, individuals would be uh, sort of relatively independent, relatively isolated packets of the world, relatively isolated parts or pieces of the world or reality in general. But I want to understand particulars in a sort of perhaps we could say from a critical perspective, where we turn back from our, we could say, naive conception of the world as given unproblematically in experience, the world as it is in itself, in some simple sense. Uh, I want to focus on the world of experience. Now, when I say world of experience, that is a reservation, that is a qualification. I don't say the world in general. I don't say just the world, uh, because I want to make that kind of distance, a kind of critical distance, critical reflective distance, where we understand that the world as it is presented to us in sense experience is not trivially synonymous with the world as it is in itself. So there is the whole epistemological and metaphysical problematic uh, of the connection of our own views of the world, our own pictures of the world, with the world as it is in itself. So that's why I want to talk about world of experience, which I may even, I may even uh, not say, I may even imply. Sometimes I just simply say the world, but I don't mean the world in some purely objective sense. I want that to be understood. So what I wanted to say is that the world of experience, we may understand the world of experience in some general sense as uh, I use certain metaphors here because I'm not really aware of uh, purely technical terms for this kind of subject matter, but I would say something like a panorama or a panoply of experience, which is as such, and before, I would say, before our conceptual uh, imposition and before our conceptual articulation, is not necessarily in some unambiguous way separated or differentiated into individuals. So I want to argue that perhaps the notion of an individual and the way we individuate things and experience by using our conception is not completely innocent, simple reception of what the world presents, but is sort of a motivated type of reasoning and understanding. Because the world, as I want to say, the world sort of, in a certain sense, suggests to us certain ways of categorizing it, certain ways of classifying things in it, certain ways of individuating things in it. It kind of suggests certain ways of individuating things, uh, but that even that presupposes some kind of conceptual what an individual is even supposed to be. So I would say that individuals are not, perhaps we could say that individuals are not necessarily metaphysically basic or ontologically primary. So individuals are also, in a certain sense, constructed. Or our conceptions of individuals are, in a certain sense, constructed, and they're not simply simple. We are not simply registering what we are seeing in the world. Well, we are partly, at least, imposing our own conceptions from our point of view of what we consider individuals. So I would argue that individuals are sort of relative to our conceptual schemes, relative to our points of view, relative to our theoretical or practical interests, values, purposes, and so on. So we may talk about what some of the criteria are for differentiating or individuating parts of the world, parts of reality. So, in a certain sense, it may be spatial or temporal contiguity. That there is quite a commonsensical notion, I would say. But even then, we may say that, you know, in a certain absolute sense, the only things that can be individuals in the strict extreme sense are some kind of basically simple and partless uh, parts of the world, if there's such a thing at all, some kind of indivisible units of reality. So now, for example, we may talk about the conceptions of those kinds of individuals with Democritus and Lysippus or Lysippus in the ancient Greece, where they conceived of atoms as being these kind of material substances which are totally indivisible, at least indivisible by using any kind of physical force. Uh, of course, they have parts. I mean, in some trivial sense, they have a left part, an upper part, a bottom part, and so on. But they are, by any conceivable physical force, they're not separable. So that's what makes them individual. That's what makes them atoms. That's what makes them indivisible units of material stuff. On the other hand, we have conceptions like Leibniz's, who conceives of those individuals, the ultimate constituents of reality, conceives of them as basically being not strictly material, although there are some, I guess there are some monads in Leibniz's conception which are, well, we could say material, but still in a deeper sense, they also have a sort of, I'm not sure what a correct English word to use there is, but they have some kind of mentality. They have some kind of at least latent, at least potential mentality or subjectivity, or however we want to put it, where even those monads we consider dead or inanimate, even they possess some kind of ability of perception. So they would have some kind of unconscious perceptions of the world around them, so to speak, which are not brought to the level of consciousness as some kind of higher or more spiritually advanced monads would possess. But still, those will be individuals, which would be essential to the conceptions of these philosophers, at least the ones that I've mentioned here. Why I think that is problematic from a certain point of view is that, for example, if you take spatial and temporal contiguity or like closeness, proximity, vicinity, or whatever other word we want to use, even that would be problematic in a certain sense, at least when we look at things strictly logically, because even spatial and temporal contiguity and proximity are sort of relative terms, right? There's no absolute spatial contiguity, for instance, right? Even the atoms would have some kind of space between them, so to speak. If you take the kind of, which, if you ask me, that's a kind of a naive physicalistic conception. But even atoms would have a certain space between, actually, pretty large space between them relative to their own respective sizes. But like, we can separate, right? We can separate parts of at least material bodies. We can separate, or we can just put them together without them necessarily forming one individual. For instance, if I take these two objects, so to speak, these two individual particulars, so to speak. Now you would say there are two, right? There's two objects in one object in one hand and one object in the other hand. And if I put them this close together, do they now form, a larger unified object? I mean, they are spatially contiguous, right? They are spatially connected. There's pretty much at least no space that I can observe between them, right? Well, also I could glue them together, for instance. You see how this gets a little bit. We can kind of reduce that kind of conception to absurdity, because we can play with those objects around us in ways that one individual may become two individuals or more than one individual may become one individual if we spatially connect them. I think that's one way to look at it. Also, if you take for example, if you think conceptions of people like Nelson Goodman, So he had a conception of individuals that doesn't really require spatial or temporal contiguity. So that may be interesting. So if you take, for example, we take I may have encountered that example before somewhere, but if you take a mirror and break it, right? So it was supposedly, in a certain sense, it was a single individual before that break, before we broke it into pieces, into parts. But still, we may take one part of that mirror and put it on the other side of the galaxy, for instance. It would still be, in a certain sense, part of that, a part of that object, right? At least it has a causal history connected, which connected with other parts. But uh, in a conception of Nelson Goodman, that individuality doesn't really require at least spatial and temporal contiguity. So that's one interesting way to look at it. So we may, it's a kind of view in mereology, right, where parts don't need to be spatially connected in order to form a single whole. You may take nothing stops us from taking a conception of, I don't know, this bottle, this water bottle in my room, and I don't know, some kind of coconut plant in, I don't know what country. Don't ask me, but some coconut plant. Nothing stops us from conceiving of those two things as forming a single larger individual. So nothing about the world strictly dictates what kind of principle of individuation we will use, and what things in the world we will classify as things at all, right? As individual beings, as individual entities. So that's one way of looking at it. So what I wanted to mention here. Okay, let me read this passage I wrote here, if you don't mind. I think I articulated it quite well there. So let me just see. So what I was talking about with the panoply, example, or panoply metaphor, or the panorama metaphor of perceptual experience. So this is the most original, undifferentiated space that we can come back to fairly well and easily and whenever we like, by just turning our attention from conceptual thoughts to mere observation, which may be outer or inner. By the way, this procedure is what is sometimes called meditation, or perhaps more accurately, mindfulness. What is presented there is not completely homogeneous all over. We can at least start there, right? That's at least the start of the or conceiving of those things as separated, in some sense, individual or independent, in some sense. So, uh, but there is not only one possible way of splitting or dividing that perceptual unity into smaller chunks that we may then consider individual objects in their own right. Some ways of dividing this display might seem to suggest themselves more naturally than do others, but this does not disqualify other ways. My underlying point is that different purposes call for different ways of division or separation, and I would venture to say that the more involved with the world practically we need to be, the less opportunity we have for more nuanced and subtle distinctions. So, if we go out to chop wood, we wouldn't really care about the, I don't know, atomic structure of the axe. It would just, for our purposes, it'll be enough that we can hold it in our hand, or whatnot, that it can actually chop wood and whatnot, right? But uh, those kinds of practical purposes, for those kinds of practical purposes, some kind of coarse-grained division of things, of the world into things, is enough, right? Uh, yeah. Okay. And I will venture to say that the more, yeah, yeah, I said that. We may easily mistake what comes naturally to us as a principle of individuation for what the world itself demands of us or suggests to us. While, let me just plug this in. My God. All right, so we may easily mistake what comes naturally to us as a principle of individuation for what the world itself, by itself, demands of us to suggest to us. While what comes naturally to us or seems spontaneous may just be both biologically and socially conditioned ways of understanding, which don't reflect some metaphysically robust facts about the world, the ways the world is divided by itself, but is a projection of our interest and purposes onto the world, or rather a cocktail of our interests and the worldly facts on the other side. So, in a more general point would be what we call the truth or knowledge is somewhere in the middle, on the meeting point of those subjective interests on the one hand and the incoming stream of worldly data, and it is a mistake to see it as either on the one or the other extreme. In other words, we can never get pure facts, but that is not to say that there are no facts at all, or that they are not at all available to us. Perception. Perception, though, for as Kant for one, and later people like Sellers or Davidson would want to say, is almost never is a purely sensory process, and some conceptual structure or understanding is inherent within it. Kant's categories are present within all experience, and we cannot even imagine an experience that is not structured according to the pure forms of the understanding. Hegel too would make distinction between purely sensory experience, which he calls sense certainty, and perception, where the former is immediate and ununiversalizable, and the latter incorporates a conceptual element, has a force of necessity behind it, and possesses a universal significance. I may come in here to to what's the word my god to intervene. I'm sorry. I may come in to intervene and say that this universal significance is not some pure perception of an objective universal immanent in the object of perception, but a property of the thought thinking its object with the use of symbols. Those symbols are general in scope, which gives them a significance that transcends or goes beyond the merely individual given, and one encompasses other similar objects of perception, and two is comprehensible to other subjects who may be able to find a similar object of perception in their respective experience. The universality in question here would then be the possession of the symbols or words, or rather the thought behind the symbols, that the symbols are used to retain and communicate. If you recognize a minimalistic or conceptualistic picture here, you're correct, since this is an anti-realist view of universality, but not completely committed to either of those two anti-realist positions. So those anti-realist positions would be nominalism on the one hand and conceptualism on the other, while nominalism says strictly speaking that universality is a property of words, of units of language, while conceptualism says yes, universality is not property strictly of words, but more of thoughts or conceptions that are behind those words in a certain sense. But both are anti-realist because they say that the universals, so to speak, are not objective parts of the world, but are sort of in the subject. So all this talk of conceptualization can easily naturally be connected to some more Eastern ways of understanding. I particularly have in mind the Buddhist concept of papancha or prapancha, which is translated, for instance, as conceptual or mental proliferation. The idea at the core here is that conceptualization falsifies the original preconceptual given in ways which are not faithful to that original reality, but more importantly lead to desire, conflict, suffering, etc. So as with the vast majority of Indian or generally Eastern, I will limit myself to Indian philosophies, they are soteriologically motivated, at least. So in the final goal of all inquiry lies not knowledge for its own sake, as Aristotle would conceive of theory or theoria in Greek, but some kind of salvation, we may say, some kind of liberation, some kind of emancipation from this finite world and whatnot, right? From suffering and whatnot. Some kind of enlightened state is pretty much the goal of all inquiry. So this idea of conceptual falsification relates nicely also to Nietzsche's extreme nominalism. Well, it kind of does, because Nietzsche too says that concepts are not necessarily the most faithful ways to describe the preconceptually given reality, but our ways of falsifying, our ways of dividing that reality into parts that suit our purposes. So basically, Nietzsche would also be, at least we can interpret Nietzsche as a sort of pragmatist in that sense, because our understanding of the world is not strictly led by epistemic interest. That's strictly led by interest in knowledge, understood in some realist way. But it's also directed and motivated by some kind of practical purpose. So that would be one thing to mention there. Let me just see. So the Buddhist philosophers, for instance, Dignaga, right? So they were seeking a way to understand how we classify things in the world, and they also had a conception of conception, right? Conception of conceptualization in general, which understands conception as not some kind of innocent way of uh, of representing the way things are in the world, but also a kind of artificial operation on that preconceptual given of experience, uh, and they wanted to understand. So for them, right, this is one way that they differ from kind of conception that I'm presenting here. Uh, they would understand individuals or particulars as kind of unproblematic actual parts of reality, although they wouldn't be strictly independent. They wouldn't be totally isolated from all of the things that exist, but they would be some kind of ultimate parts of the world in some kind of metaphysically robust way. So they would be nominalists, strictly speaking, when it comes to language and conception, but they would understand individuals as some kind of unproblematic category, if we can talk about ontological categories in the Buddhist tradition or something like that. But I would go even further than that. So they would say that we conceive of species, we conceive of natural kinds, as they may be called, or we conceive of universals as we only conceive of universals by that artificial imposition upon that kind of panoply, as I said, of perceptual experience. They would understand they would understand perception as purely sensory, not in a way that Kant or Hegel might understand it. So we conceive of kinds, we conceive of what is universal in the world by imposing our own conceptual thought categories, uh, uh, and saying that one thing, that which is one thing in reality, consists of different parts or different properties, we may say. They wouldn't be realists about the properties. They wouldn't say that those properties are abstract entities that exist independently of those particulars in which they are instantiated. But they would say that the individuals are properly metaphysically real, while the properties are abstracted from that individual, and naturally they belong only within individuals, right? They cannot strictly be separated from them. And also another important point is that those properties, so to speak, right? We use the same word for many different varieties of the same kind of property, right? We call it by the same name. We use the same general term, but strictly speaking, in reality, they're not identical. They're merely similar. So there is also kind of falsification by conception, where they introduce the category of sameness of properties between individuals, where there is really none to be found in reality. So, and also another way is, yeah, that's so the sameness, the conceptual artificial operation would go by finding the same properties shared by multiple objects. That's one thing. Another thing is finding parts are not probably not the best word, but aspects of one thing by dividing it into singular properties or relations and what have you, right? So we also those are two ways we conceptually proliferate. Those are two ways we conceptually falsify reality. Well, I will also say that those individuals too are, in a certain sense, a product of our own conceptualization, and the world doesn't, in some kind of simple and pure sense, present us with individuals. With the world doesn't present us with a screen of experience that is strictly divided into individuals. But for our own practical and theoretical purposes, we divide that kind of screen of experience, that kind of field, a perceptual field, into multiple individuals, right? So, when we say perceptual field, phenomenologists like Husserl and Merleau-Ponty come to mind, of course. This is maybe a sort of a phenomenological approach, we may say, but it may even go deeper than some of those phenomenologies themselves would allow, because Husserl, for all I know, right, Husserl is a kind of an essentialist, more or less, right? Husserl has a conception of properties, conception of those things which correspond to our conceptions in the objects, uh, which I see as going back at least to Leibniz, as being somehow prescribed by the very way the world is, or things are, right? So there are only certain sorts of ways that are allowed, epistemically allowed, rationally allowed for us to conceive of the world. Uh, whether Husserl is a strict realist about universals, I will leave that maybe for. I'll leave that question open, but I feel like with his idea of eidetic eidetic intuition, so we can kind of perceive essences as if those are objective properties of the world in some real sense. But yes, I would go even deeper than that, even deeper than the nominalism of I don't know, of the Buddhists, for instance, as I mentioned here. But who is an important interlocutor here? I take Hume to be a very important interlocutor, because Hume is also critical in that way that I think we should be critical in our thinking about the world, where he says that even the division of the world into individuals is a sort of subjective imposition, more or less, right? At least to a degree. Uh, yes, and he says it's not even an imposition by reason, but more of with imagination. He talks about the imagination as being that kind of relevant psychological faculty which finds finds some kind of patterns in perceptual experience, which is, preconceptually, it is just one. It is a unity. It is undivided, and we then more or less artificially divide that perceptual experience. Uh, Habit, also psychological habit, may surely come in there as a factor, because we had certain experiences, we had relatively similar experiences, and that's why we kind of spot patterns which are not really totally objectively there in the world, but we kind of conceive of things in those ways because it's practically useful, at least, to conceive of them in those ways. Which also brings us to sort of pragmatism that maybe James or Dewey might espouse, but I don't feel authorized to speak of their conception of individuals here at this point. But I wanted to mention Nietzsche, Kant, Hegel, the Buddhists like Dignaga Dharmakirti, right? Also Hume, and who else? Was there anyone else? Yeah, the phenomenologists Husserl and Merleau-Ponty. So those are the people I wanted to mention here. And I feel like this has been more or less enough. I don't feel like I've articulated my ideas as completely as I maybe could have, but I feel relatively satisfied with this video so far. It's been a half an hour pretty much, and I'll just leave it at that for now. And I urge you to subscribe if you want more of this kind of content. I urge you to comment, like, share, and whatnot. And also, if you want, if you feel so inclined, you may consider supporting me via PayPal. I will post a link to my PayPal account in the description. Also, another way you can support me in a more material kind of way. So also post content often and regularly on Facebook, Instagram, WordPress, sometimes Substack or Medium. So if you want to follow me on those websites, you can feel free to do so. And for now, I'll say goodbye to everyone and hope you're all doing well. And I'll see you in the next installment. Bye bye.